So McCulloch is in many ways an amazing opinion. Marshall is expressing really a worldview, a vision of the political economy of the United States. So on the one hand, he has to answer a very specific question. Did the U.S., did the federal government have the authority to incorporate a bank, a national bank? And if it did, can a state tax that federal institution? On the other hand, on his way to answering that question, he expresses a whole vision of the political economy. So he starts off the opinion with a very powerful defense of the Supreme Court's authority in deciding profound and divisive questions. He covers the supremacy of federal law in the opinion. He talks about important legal practices like ratification by practice. He's encountering this question, 25 years after the first Bank of the United States has gone into operation. So he covers all that, even short of the specific legal questions in the case. His answers to those legal questions have become famous, but really the most remarkable thing to me is how much those answers fit within this wider worldview. Including, I would say, I should mention, he also talks about the power of the states and rejects a kind of compact theory of the Constitution, rejecting the notion that the states have the prerogative to delegate power to the federal government, and that that's the source of the federal government's power. And in discussing that, he brings in, he kind of smuggles in, except his language is so expansive that smuggling would be the wrong way, he works in a powerful articulation of popular sovereignty and the responsibility and prerogative of the people to determine the shape of the United States government and federal authority. One of the things that's interesting about McCulloch is that it's usually taught as a case about federal power and federal authority, and Marshall's determination that federal authority is large and robust. More rarely do people actually ask, so what was McCulloch, what was the kind of federal authority at issue? And in McCulloch, the issue is who makes money, right? Does the federal government have authority to create the monetary system in this particular way? And can the states interfere with that authority? So this takes us actually way back to the constitutional moment. The Constitution was in significant part a debate over monetary authority. That's not a formality, that's about nation building. You can't build a nation, you can't mobilize resources unless you have a money supply and the ability to control it. And the framers were intensely aware of this. Just to tell a story about that constitutional moment, it's written against the 1780s, a moment of turmoil and disarray in the new states, the newly independent states, and that in the 1780s are written against the revolutionary moment. In significant part, the revolution is won on the basis of paper money. The Continental Dollar, you might have heard of, is an IOU that the Continental Congress issues and uses to pay troops. Meanwhile, all the states are issuing IOUs. Nobody has the time to go find coin and borrow coin and distribute it. So the Continental Congress acting for the Continental Union and the states are all issuing their own IOUs. As the war goes on, they also issue debt. They start to pay people in debt. So they pay people in bonds that say, the Continental Congress or the state of Maryland will pay off this debt in the future at this percentage interest. So they're actually literally paying people in dollars and they're paying people in debt. They win the war on that kind of money. It's really remarkable. On both debt, circulating debt that bears interest, and dollars that are IOUs. 1780s, part of the big drama of the 1780s is that no one's quite sure how to pay off that debt. The federal union doesn't have the authority to tax, so it can't support its own debt that it gave its soldiers. The states have the authority to tax, they're busy paying off their own debt. The Congress finally decides that what it will do is place a quota on all these states to pay off parts of the federal debt when it fails to get the ability to tax from the states. So this creates, the reason this background is important is that it puts at issue both the power of the unified government and the power of the states. And what the states do varies, and it's whatever they do is controversial. So some of them tax heavily in gold and silver coin to try to pay off their own debt and the federal debt. That creates riots, including Shays' Rebellion, famous kind of movement in Western Massachusetts, 1787. Some of them, instead of trying to tax heavily, start to take in paper money for taxes or start to take in circulating bonds for taxes. This does not support, as at high a level, the value of those instruments, so they begin to lose value. So there's turmoil in that period over what money is and who has the authority to make it and how it holds its value. And that turmoil is a very important baseline for the constitutional moment. The Federalist Party, Hamilton's party, is extremely upset at the treatment of debt, most of which has changed hands and has arrived in the hands of wealthier individuals who would like it to be supported at a higher level. So fast forward to the constitutional moment, one question for the framers is what kind of money the new United States should have and who should make it. Three alternatives. One alternative, gold and silver coin. No controversy about that, but there's not nearly enough of it to service an economy without prices dropping constantly, which is devastating to an economy. Second alternative, IOUs, like the Continental Dollar, either produced by the states, many of which, 7, I think, have already started producing IOUs again during the 1780s, or bills of credit produced by the United States. Third alternative, a national bank. So this is really the root of McCulloch. Hamilton is the architect of the national bank. He's very aware that for the last century, the British have been revolutionizing the way money's made because they're the first ones in Europe to successfully create a centralized, powerful, sustained national bank. The English bank and the Bank of the United States are themselves revolutionary institutions. They're radical changes from the way money was made before, medieval or early modern money, which was mainly coin. The way those banks work is that a government will put public debt with a bank and take the value of the public debt in atomized form, that is, in little bits of debt, which are dollars. So the Bank of the United States is created when the government establishes this group of investors. They all subscribe to the capital to the bank. Most of that capital is subscribed. Actually, they're investing by putting public debt with the bank. The bank then can issue dollars up to the amount of that public debt. So Hamilton is supporting the value of public debt that's left over from the Revolution. He's trying to keep the value of that public debt up, but he's also using public debt as the resource against which he's going to create currency. So there's a huge scarcity of money. You can't run a political economy without money. You can't do it on the basis of coin alone. If you can do it on bank currency, on banknotes, you can double, triple, quadruple the amount of specie by relying on banknotes and sending those banknotes into circulation. Then you simply, one last point that's interesting about the bank, you simply tax in the banknotes and you pay back the bank. You don't actually, no one actually ever has to cash the banknotes for gold or silver coin. So what Hamilton is doing, and what's one of the many really incredibly important things about the Bank of the United States, is it's a method of creating money. It's a method of creating the dollar and distributing it into circulation. So Hamilton's deeply committed to doing this. He'll get a federal dollar into circulation, and he'll also be able to support the public debt and the value of the public debt, which is also important to federal authority. So this design for money alarms many people who are convinced that the states have managed money supplies in fair and equitable ways. If you think about the old system in which states are basically issuing IOUs and then taxing them back in, that gives states and state legislatures an enormous amount of flexibility in managing the pressures on debtors and on managing monetary value. So while the Federalists are convinced that in the 1780s the states have been irresponsible and have allowed too much leeway to debtors, the Jeffersonians, first the Anti-Federalists and the people who become the Jeffersonians and the Democratic Republicans, they're convinced that the states weren't lenient enough, didn't understand that you couldn't raise taxes on people who were just getting back to work. It's a post-war recession, money's very scarce. So from their point of view, the state latitude to manage money was enormously important. So they are very skeptical of Hamilton, who they see as, after all, we've just broken away from Britain, right? And Hamilton now wants to install this imperial design at the center of the American system. So for them, that's scandalous. The Constitution doesn't say anything about the potential of a bank. And therein lies the problem, right? The federal government is supposed to have enumerated powers only, those powers that are listed in the Constitution. The Constitution says nothing about a bank, and it says nothing about federal power to incorporate any institution, including a bank. And in fact, during the debates about the shape and text of the Constitution, there had been a small exchange about whether there should be a provision in the Constitution giving the federal government the power to incorporate a bank, and participants had decided not to include that provision. So according to some, including Jefferson and Madison, that implied that the federal government did not have the power to incorporate entities. Whereas, on the other hand, you could argue, Hamilton argues they didn't need to include that provision because it was implicit in the Constitution. That itself, that debate over whether the federal government had the authority to incorporate institutions, including a national bank, just blows up in 1791 and is ultimately decided by George Washington, who sides with Alexander Hamilton. Marshall is a Federalist. Increasingly clear about that in the 1790s, which is interesting because he's a Virginian. The Virginians are skeptical. I mean, Madison and Jefferson, a number of these elite Virginian politicians are the ones who start the Democratic Republican Party, Jefferson's party. And Marshall is a distant cousin of Jefferson. You'd think that some of those same experiences would inform him. The Virginian politicians seem very confident of their ability to lead popular politics, and therefore may have more confidence in state level activities, but not Marshall. So Marshall sides with Hamilton. Money is nation building, and the time that nations are most aware of that is wartime. During the Revolution, this is what brought money to the fore of the debates. You have to have something to pay soldiers, to buy supplies, to pay for enforcement, to pay for POWs and their upkeep. There's a very expensive project that comes along with wartime activity, and you need to have a currency to run a war in. So the War of 1812 makes this completely clear to me. So there's clear to people. There are some really telling episodes in the War of 1812. So one of them is, if you have no federal money, you have money created by the states. We haven't talked about that yet, but even once the Bank of the United States is in operation, there's still not enough money at the state level. And states themselves have the power to charter, so they charter their own banks. The Bank of the United States drops out in the war in 1811 or so. all that's left is state money. So the United States has to use state banknotes in order to pay its own troops. State chartered banks, the notes from state chartered banks, which may be banks of very different credibility, issuing notes with lots of different values, and you're paying your own troops with these banknotes whose value you don't really know. So there's a story about some troops in Tennessee which are paid with banknotes from a state in Ohio. They take the banknotes, they go to pay their taxes with them, their federal taxes, and the federal tax collector won't accept them because he doesn't have faith in the Ohio bank that issued them. So this is an unsustainable situation. You can't pay your troops with money that your own government doesn't think is credible. In the end, the United States, sort of stumbles to the end of the War of 1812. Happily, it's a less expensive war, much less expensive than the Revolution, using state banknotes and using something called treasury bills, which are kind of federal IOUs, and then really faces the question, should they recharter the bank? At that point, Madison and Jefferson agree. There's consensus on the bank, on rechartering a bank. It's still a momentous decision. So the United States could have gone, as I was mentioning earlier, this is a radical new institution. National banks are the most revolutionary institution of the time, I think. I mean, this is really the system that we use today, to use money made by investors through banks, to put public debt with banks and take their banknotes, the investors' banknotes, and then tax those. It's a move towards a public-private kind of partnership as opposed to maintaining completely public authority over the money supply. The national bank is the 800-pound gorilla in a network of banks. So banks work relationally. Banks work relationally because every time they issue a banknote in this era, they're promising gold or silver coin. Today they're promising reserves, so something similar. And that means they're vulnerable when people cash their notes. And they're issuing more they're issuing more banknotes than they have gold or silver coin. That's their bank model, right? They have to lend to people long-term in these notes and hold on to a certain amount of silver and gold, and they succeed because not everyone cashes their banknotes at once. Many people are content to hold on to banknotes. Many people are savers, not spenders, and they're holding on to their banknotes. Having said that, they're constantly at risk that someone will cash their banknotes, and therefore they're constantly lending back and forth to each other and working in relation to each other to maintain their system. The Bank of the United States is the biggest bank in this system by far. So it has, according to some estimates, half the amount of specie in circulation. According to other estimates, much more than half. So much more than all the other banks, certainly more than any of them individually, and possibly as much of all of them put together. It also holds the United States deposits, so it's a really big player. That means that the Bank of the United States can police the other banks. If it demands that they redeem their notes at certain points, or it demands that they redeem their notes all at once, it can create a credit crunch in those banks, or it can destroy banks if they're not ready to redeem their notes, if they're not willing, for example, to lend to banks that might need an advance. So the Bank of the United States becomes a kind of policeman in the center of this relational system of banks. So the Bank of the United States can put other banks out of business. It can also crash the US monetary system. I should add another thing that people, it's not only fear, it's also ambition. So I mentioned that when the Bank of the United States went into business, Bank of the United States won, it didn't fill the territory. It didn't satisfy completely the need for money. Moreover, it was lending to a particular group of people, mostly merchants, those whom the Federalists thought were most important and most valuable and most commercially energetic, the people who were going to build the new world, right? That was mostly merchants. The Bank of the United States didn't lend to farmers. So the Jeffersonians, our opponents, go into business in the States chartering banks that would lend to farmers and to other groups. As those banks became more and more numerous and robust, states began to have their own, had never abandoned their own ambition to control their own economies, and they begin to ascend and to assert more control over their economies. So they actually resent the Bank of the United States. They don't think it's necessary. Eventually, New York banks, Wall Street, will ally themselves with the Jacksonians against the Bank of the United States, believe it or not, right? So it's really the Wall Streeters understand New York to be a financial center that can compete with the United States. The Bank of the United States, too, is a poorly managed bank, staffed by speculators and people who are interested in a quick buck, in the rising value of war debt left from the War of 1812. There's a lot of overlending, poor lending on, to poor business prospects, and a fair amount of corruption. There's a spike in prices and inflation after the war, and the country is still not on its feet yet economically. That triggers a bank run, and there's a collapse in the banking sectors. At that time, the Bank of the United States saves itself, right? Instead of, today we think of national banks, which become central banks, as lending because they can create money against national debt. They can save other banks. But the Bank of the United States, too, pulls in its outstanding credit in order to save its own specie reserve. And that devastates the state banking sector. State banks collapse. Marshall has a vision of the United States and the federal government as a robust central authority that can anchor a liberal political economy, classically liberal, right, small L, an economy in which there are individuals transacting with secure property rights and significant respect for investors. He thinks that this will be supported by a federal government that can act swiftly and surely in support of those actors, and that will pull the United States out of recession and actually make it a world leader. So he's also interested in pushing back on states' rights doctrine and theories that are swelling at the time. He wants to articulate a strong role for popular voice, understood as an aggregate of Americans across their states, acting together across their states. So he wants to flesh out a vision of national political authority based on that diverse population. And finally, he wants a strong role for the court. He understands the court as the arbiter of important and continuing debates, and he thinks that the only way to maintain peace in the United States is to send those questions to the court, and for the court to claim jurisdiction over important questions. I think there's no doubt he understood the economic power of the United States as a unifying force. So part of what he's interested in is defining property and contract rights clearly and powerfully, generally on behalf of investors and creditors and members of corporations, because he felt it was important to liberate those people to act and to build powerful businesses. So we're not talking monopolies. He's not a creature of the end of the 19th century, but I think he's convinced by Hamilton that there can't be a powerful, vibrant nation without strong support for economic activity. The really transformative move in the modern era, as far as money creation is concerned, is to use a national bank, which became a central bank for that purpose. And that's like a money creation machine, right? If the government borrows, the national bank buys that debt, or in the case of the United States, so the first bank took on the debt directly and issued money against it. The Fed buys that debt from banks and issues money against it. That is just a profound difference from the medieval and early modern world, where sovereigns were limited by the amount of gold and silver in circulation and how much they could make into coin. Now, for the first time, you actually have nations that can create a money supply through credit. They're basically creating credit against national debt that can circulate and lubricate, nurturing all sorts of economic activity at the ground level. So what national banks, the reason they were transformative is that they figured out that the architects of those banks figured out how to make money that could reach retail level and actually resolve all the scarcities of money that had plagued the medieval and early modern era. The Bank of the United States and the Fed share that. The Fed is in some ways different because the demise of the Bank of the United States too, under Jackson, right? So now we're talking 1836, 1837, returned monetary power to the states, or returned might not be quite the right word. The states take monetary power, and the power of the states has always been enormously important to the United States. It's basic to federalism. The states reassert and refine and elaborate banking and banking traditions in the decades after the demise of the Bank of the United States too. And the Fed today, in part, recognizes state power by having a kind of regional structure. So you've heard of the 12 banks of the Fed. So that's different, and that's in some ways a heritage of state power that we've assimilated and institutionalized in the Fed. And the other thing that's similar comes from both state and federal heritage is that private individuals and creditors, bankers, are enormously important actors in our economy. So the idea behind that Hamilton has and that Marshall agrees with is that we're going to allow bankers to have an important and influential role lending to the government, and they're going to act. We're going to use their IOUs. So today we have Federal Reserve notes. It doesn't say, United States notes, it says Federal Reserve notes. Bankers have been institutionalized as important actors in our political economy, and the structure of the Fed includes a lot of influence and power by bankers. So we've structured our Federal Reserve banks in ways that recognize and incorporate the power of bankers who are running the regional reserves. I think Gibbons is completely consistent with the vision that there's some federal power that's greater than the sum of the states, and that's different from the sum of the states, right? So in Gibbons, we do understand that that commerce between states is expansively defined. That we're going to understand that the federal government has an interest and authority over commerce that runs into states and out of states, right? Because it concerns the whole, the federal government can take control of it or has authority over it, even if it's in any particular moment inside of a state. Completely consistent with his vision. Right, so the decisions that I know of his, anyway, I do see a consistency. So we've already talked about the fact that he understands federal authority, national authority as an important kind of infrastructure for the economy. We've talked about that where money is concerned. He understands also that corporations are, and that corporate entities need to be clearly defined and in his view, I think, liberated to go do economic activity, and he understands legal doctrines like property and contract. He's working, as I understand him, he's working over a course of decades to shape contract and to define corporations in ways that are consistent with this vision, right? To use national authority to define them in ways that will empower them and thus affect the larger economy. Part of Marshall's vision, as I mentioned before, is that individuals and individual entrepreneurs are important. And he believes that corporations, groups of individuals, can act in ways that will make them particularly productive as corporations. Dartmouth College is a fascinating case because in that case he has a corporation, right, a chartered entity, Dartmouth College, and the state of New Hampshire is asserting authority to renegotiate, if you will, the grant of authority that they made to that group and to their successors. So corporations historically or traditionally, before Marshall gets a hold of them, corporations are generally entities empowered by states. We've already learned about the controversy about whether the federal government can charter corporations, but states, no one disputes that states can empower groups of individuals to act as corporations. And the reason that power is important is that the states are basically, in the old way of thinking, delegating authority to these groups and privileging their actions, things like allowing them to sue and be sued, hand property on down through the lifetime of a corporation. What Marshall's concerned about is that while that seems to him a tonic delegation by states, he doesn't want states to continue to interfere in the activities of these groups once states have defined them and delegated authority to them. So in Dartmouth College, the state of New Hampshire wants to alter the charter and create a new board of trustees for Dartmouth College, and in fact it does so. There's Dartmouth University operating for several years, I think the same time as Dartmouth College, while this case is decided. And this is very, I would say, assertive action by Marshall. So he has to deal both with the fact that historically sovereigns have had a fair amount of power to redefine or renegotiate the grants of authority they've given to corporations. So one challenge is that he has to, and what he does in Dartmouth College is reinterpret or interpret the charter of corporation as a contract, a move which, once he's thinking contract, he thinks more restrictively about state power. So once he's got a contract between a state, a sovereign and its successor state, New Hampshire, and a group of individuals, then he's going to limit state authority after the contract is formed to change the contract, the way we would understand the limits on individual authority to change a contract once it's made unilaterally to change the contract. The other thing that Marshall does in Dartmouth College that's really remarkable is he's reinterpreted the charter as a contract. Arguably, it wasn't a contract of that type when the sovereign first made that grant of authority. Once he's got a contract, he brings that contract within the Contracts Clause of the Constitution, which is a provision in Article 1, Section 10, that prohibits states from laws that impair contracts. That provision was clearly, even Marshall recognizes it wasn't meant for this kind of situation. It was actually meant for the 1780s for Congress is actually worried about states changing the value of money and giving debtors relief, and that's the contracts. Those are the contracts they were worried about. And that's what that provision was written to target. And Marshall picks it up and says, we understand it wasn't written for this, but although it might be a rare case, the Contracts Clause applies here. So what he's doing is finding a way to use federal authority to police state authority over contracts, right? He wants to police state behavior over corporations and the contracts that create those corporations. So he's finding a way to police state economic activity, and that is going to affect banks, insurance companies, canal companies, turnpike companies, all those companies that states can create. Marshall is now saying, and we're going to oversee the way you treat those companies once you've delegated authority to the individuals as a group. They now have their own vested rights and their own claims against the state. So the contracts clause is a real sleeper in our jurisprudence. 1L classes are taught to focus on judicial review and on Marbury, but in fact, the Supreme Court only strikes down federal authority in Marbury and then not again until Dred Scott, right, 1857. Instead, what they're doing in the meantime is using the contracts clause again and again to police state behavior. This is, again, part of Marshall's worldview. So the Federalists were skeptical of the states. Their project is to expand federal authority and make the world safe for individual actors and for the kind of economy that they see as anchored by the national bank. The contracts clause expresses, in Marshall's hands, a project of defining contract as a significant protection for investors and for creditors, and a significant way of, as we talked about with Dartmouth College, limiting the ability of states to intervene and to reshape the power of corporations. So for him, it's an extremely important tool to kind of shape the vocabulary of the economy, and I think that's what he's doing with it. I think his articulation of popular sovereignty, of the importance of a democratic principle of voice and decision-making is spot on. Right? I think this is the way that, this captures our hope and belief today in the ability of people rather than some other outside or overweening authority to determine their own fates. And I think I would agree as well. I understand that out of that vision comes a commitment to building a robust economy. I disagree with him because I think that the economy he built was one that erred too far to protect creditors and investors and bankers in defining what a fair and robust economy would mean. He's not alone in this, of course, but Hamilton's vision is really one in which we protect the interest of investors, that we understand the sustainability of the economy as built on the interest of investors and their action in pursuit of profits. The same could be said of corporations. To some extent, he's breaking loose corporations from their traditional responsibility to communities understood, sort of politically defined and represented in that time by the states. I believe that the Democratic Republicans, the Anti-Federalists before them, had a point. They understood that sometimes one doesn't rely on investment-driven decisions and on institutions that are delegated and organized around private interest in order to create a fair economy. So they understood that at times in recessions and in moments where it was important to stimulate the economy, the states had an important role in supporting those who were poor, the debtors, the people who were trying to get back on their feet, and that in the immediate term that meant extending state economic assistance to those people. So that might very well be through creating, in their case, they're thinking state-based stimulus for those people. I think I might want to talk to him about Dartmouth College. I think I would like to know exactly how he thought about chartered institutions and how much he valued their tradition of public regarding activity. And I'd like to hear him on states as communities that could represent a vision of the public welfare. I'd really like to hear him respond to those concerns, maybe particularly where Virginia, using Virginia as an example. And then I'd probably press him on the vision which I see as, in some ways, creditor-centered, right? Capitalist. The vision that puts so much faith in the ability of bankers and of those running corporations to make decisions. You know, the idea that's implicit is that those people making decisions in their own self-interest will ultimately create economic goods for everyone. We know that it doesn't quite work out that way, so I think I'd like to hear him on that alternative and ask him to compare the two for me. I would have to say he's one of the architects of the Constitution. His influence and articulation of what the Constitution meant created the Constitution that we have today.